Tonight, the journey we take together moves across 28 centuries to a hillside above a wild and flooding river, where a man lifted a plow and drew a line in the earth. That line was not merely a boundary. It was a declaration, a covenant with gods who may or may not have been listening. And it was the first breath of a city that would, in time, inhale the entire known world. The man who held that plow was named Romulus, and his story is one of the strangest, most violent, most achingly human origin stories in all of civilization. He was, by legend, nursed by a wolf. He was, by claim, the son of a god. He was, by history, a founder who murdered his own brother to lay the first stone of his dream. Was he a hero? A monster? Perhaps history does not always give us the luxury of choosing between those two. And beside him, in this story's beginning though not in its end, stands his twin, Remus. Born of the same womb, shaped by the same hills, fed by the same wolf. History records him as the loser. But some have argued that he was, in some essential way, the truer soul of what Rome might have been. And behind them both, the woman without whom neither would have existed, Rhea Silvia. A princess made a priestess by her uncle's ambition. A woman who loved in defiance of sacred law and paid for it in chains, and whose suffering became, somehow, the seed of an empire. This is not simply the story of how a city was built. This is the oldest question civilization asks of itself: what are we made of? What was the price of the first stone? And do we, still, carry that debt forward? Settle in. Close your eyes if you like. We are going to Rome. The 8th century before the Common Era. Italy is not yet a name for a unified place, it is a peninsula of tribes and hilltop communities. Each with its own gods, its own customs, its own relationship with the land. Imagine standing at the edge of the Tiber River in the early spring of what we would call 753 BCE. The air is thick with the smell of river mud and wood smoke, of wild fennel and the faint sweetness of blossoming plum. The Tiber runs high and brown with snowmelt from the Apennine Mountains. Restless and unpredictable, nothing like the tamed waterway it would eventually become beneath the stone bridges and marble embankments of a later age. There are 7 hills here. The Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, and 4 others, modest elevations rising 40 or 60 feet above the marshy lowlands. But significant enough to offer defenders an advantage, to channel breezes that kept the worst of the swamp fever at bay. On these hills, small communities of Latin-speaking farmers and herders have established themselves. They tend their flocks. They plant their grain in the rich alluvial soil the flooding river deposits each spring. They offer prayers to gods of hearth and harvest. They are tough, practical people who have not yet written down their language. Who have no unified political structure, no standing army, no city in any meaningful sense. They are, by the standards of their neighbors, peripheral people. To the north, the Etruscans are already flourishing. They work bronze and iron with extraordinary skill. They plan cities. Their women recline alongside their husbands at banquets. A custom so startling to the more conservative Greeks that it became a kind of byword for Etruscan licentiousness. In their painted tombs, which we can still walk into today, the dancers are still moving on the walls, the musicians still playing, the colors still vivid after 26 centuries. These are people who have already solved many of the problems the Latins are only beginning to confront. To the south, the Greeks have planted their colonial cities along the coasts of Sicily and the Italian boot the region they call Magna Graecia, Great Greece. Syracuse, Cumae, Neapolis, these are already sophisticated urban centers where Homer is recited, where philosophical debate is a form of civic entertainment. Where traders from Egypt and Phoenicia and the Aegean bring their goods and their ideas. Between these two civilizational poles, the Latin farmers on their hills are sitting at a beginning they do not yet know is a beginning. To understand what happens next, you need to understand a city that no longer exists, Alba Longa. Located about 12 miles southeast of where Rome would rise, Alba Longa was the dominant city-state of the Latin peoples in this era. Tradition, and we are now squarely in the territory where history and legend move through the same rooms. Tradition held that Alba Longa was founded by Ascanius, the son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who had fled the burning ruins of Troy and made his way west to Italy. The Romans would later build an entire mythology around this lineage, claiming descent from Troy, from Venus herself through Aeneas. Whether or not Aeneas was a historical figure, the belief in this ancestry mattered enormously to the Romans who came after. It was identity. It was destiny. It was the story they told themselves about why they were meant for greatness. But in the decades before Rome's founding, Alba Longa is the scene of something more immediately human: a family destroying itself. The king of Alba Longa, Procas, died with 2 sons. Numitor, the elder, and Romulus, the younger. The throne should have passed to Numitor, and initially, it did. But Romulus had something his brother lacked: a ruthlessness that made him dangerous regardless of legal right. He overthrew Numitor. He killed Numitor's sons, eliminating the male line. And then he turned to Numitor's daughter, a young woman named Rhea Silvia, and made her a Vestal virgin. To understand the weight of what that meant, you need to know who the Vestals were. They were the priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the sacred hearth, the fire that burned continuously in her round temple at the heart of Roman religious life. The Vestals' duty was to keep that fire alive, always, without interruption. If it went out, it was an omen of catastrophe for the city. They served for 30 years. During that time, they were required to remain completely chaste. No marriage, no children, no love. To violate this vow was not merely a crime. It was sacrilege, punishable by being buried alive, entombed in the earth. With a small supply of food and water, left to extinguish in the darkness like the sacred fire, she had failed. When Romulus forced Rhea Silvia into this role, he was not sending her to prison. He was erasing her future. He was ending Numitor's bloodline as cleanly and deniably as if he had drawn a knife. A Vestal virgin could not marry, could not give birth, could not produce the heir who might one day challenge Romulus's stolen throne. It was a perfect scheme. Except that a god intervened. The god was Mars, the Roman god of war, one of the most powerful and terrifying figures in the Roman divine world. The ancient sources are careful, even artful, in how they describe what happened. Some say Mars appeared to Rhea Silvia in the sacred grove where she went to draw water, that the encounter was overwhelming, that she had no choice. Others speak of a dream, a divine visitation so numinous she could not be certain afterward of the boundary between vision and reality. The language manages, across centuries, to remain both explicit and discreet. What is not discreet is the result. Rhea Silvia was pregnant. She was imprisoned, chained, according to some sources. Her uncle's reaction was exactly what you would expect from a man who had arranged her entire life around preventing this very outcome. He moved to contain the damage, and that meant dealing with the children she would bear. When the twins were born, 2 boys, strong and healthy, Romulus gave the order. They were to be drowned in the Tiber. One of history's most consequential moments of planned infanticide. The servants assigned to this task were, apparently, less than fully committed to it. The Tiber was in spring flood, dangerous and fast. They placed the basket containing the infants at the flood line on the riverbank and retreated. When the waters subsided, the basket came to rest at the foot of a wild fig tree, the Ficus ruminalis, as it would be remembered for centuries. And then a she-wolf emerged from the trees. She did not eat them. She nursed them. This image is perhaps the single most recognizable image in all of Roman history. A wolf, fierce and wild, crouching over 2 small infants, her body curving around them in something that reads unmistakably as protection, as care. The Capitoline wolf, the bronze sculpture that represents this moment, stands today in the Capitoline museums in Rome. The wolf herself is Etruscan, probably from the 5th century BCE. The infant figures of Romulus and Remus were added in the Renaissance. But the image has been part of Rome's identity since before the city had any art to speak of. What does it mean that the founders of Rome were nursed by a wolf? The wolf in Roman symbolism was an animal of Mars, wild, fierce, belonging to the space outside civilization's boundaries. For the Romans to claim descent from wolf-nursed children was to say something about their nature that they drew on something older and rawer than the sophistication of the Etruscans. Something more elemental than the philosophical refinement of the Greeks. They were of the wilderness as much as of the city. Their strength came from the edge, from the margin, from the place where the cultivated world gave out and something older began. A woodpecker also came to feed the children, bringing morsels of food to the infants who could not yet hunt for themselves. The woodpecker, too, was sacred to Mars. The Divine Father had not abandoned his sons. Faustulus, a shepherd in the service of King Romulus himself, came upon the scene and brought the infants home to his wife, Acca Laurentia. She nursed them alongside her own children. In a shepherd's hut on the Palatine Hill, the future founders of the city that would swallow the world grew up learning to tend sheep and fight and survive. Picture them as young men, Romulus and Remus, roaming the hills above the Tiber. Tanned, hard-muscled, fast. They know these hills the way you only know a place you have run through since childhood, every outcropping, every spring, every hidden valley. Where a flock could shelter in bad weather. And they are leaders. When other young men hesitate, these two move forward. When injustice occurs, a raid on a neighboring shepherd's flock, a dispute with landowners, they do not simply endure it. They organize. They resist. Around them, a band begins to form: runaway slaves, dispossessed farmers, young men from the margins who have nothing to lose. The classic composition of a revolutionary coalition. The twins were alike in their courage and their energy, but different in temperament. Romulus was the planner, quiet, watchful, strategic, the one who thought 3 moves ahead before speaking. Remus was faster, more open, quicker to laugh and quicker to anger. Those who knew them both may have loved Remus more freely. But Romulus was the one who frightened people, and sometimes that is what leadership requires. The revelation of their identity came, according to tradition, through a crisis. Remus was captured during a conflict over cattle, taken by agents of Romulus and brought to the very court from which his grandfather Numitor had been expelled. When Faustulus told Romulus the truth, who they were, whose grandsons, what had been taken from their family, something shifted permanently in both young men. They were not shepherds, they were princes in exile. And the man who sat on Alba Longa's throne had murdered their uncles, imprisoned their mother, and tried to have them drowned. Romulus assembled his followers. They marched on Alba Longa. Romulus was killed. Numitor, their grandfather, was restored to his throne. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was freed from her chains. The arc of justice had bent, at last, in the right direction. But now came the harder question. What next? Numitor was king of Alba Longa. 2 ambitious grandsons could not simply fold themselves back into that existing order. They were too much, too large for that. They would found a new city on the hills where they had grown up, beside the river they knew, in the landscape that had made them. But a new city needs a single king. And there were 2 of them. Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill. Remus wanted the Aventine. Neither would yield. They agreed to let the gods decide through augury, the reading of bird signs. A practice the Romans had adopted from their Etruscan neighbors and would use for centuries to legitimize decisions that might otherwise be challenged. They separated, each to his chosen hill, each watching the sky. Remus saw his omen first: 6 vultures, wheeling above the Aventine. Then Romulus claimed 12. Who had the stronger sign? The one who had seen first, or the one who had seen more? The followers of each brother argued the question with the intensity of men whose futures depended on the answer. Because they did depend on it. There is a moment in the founding of any human institution, a family, a company, a nation, when the people involved must decide whether they can live together with an unresolved disagreement, or whether the disagreement will split them. Romulus and Remus could not find that resolution. Romulus began to dig. The plowing of a city's sacred boundary, the pomerium, was one of the most solemn acts in Roman religious practice. The furrow of the plow defined the space that was the city, separated it from the space that was not. To jump across that furrow was to commit an act of profound symbolic violation. It was the kind of transgression that, in a world where ritual boundaries were taken with deadly seriousness, could not go unanswered. Remus jumped across it. The ancient sources give us different versions of what happened next. Some say Romulus himself, in a fury of wounded pride and religious outrage, struck his brother down. Others attribute the killing to a lieutenant named Seller, Quick Seller, whose name would later become a byword for speed, and whose action may have been either an excess of loyalty or a perfectly calculated move that Romulus could then publicly mourn. Still, other traditions suggest the killing happened in a general brawl between the supporters of the two brothers. What we know is that Remus died. Some sources preserve a last taunt he supposedly called out as he vaulted over the unfinished wall. Will your enemies be as easily stopped by this? Whether that is history or dramatic embellishment, we cannot say. Romulus is said to have wept over his brother's body. He is also said to have declared, with a coldness that reads as almost inhuman, "So perish anyone else who crosses my walls." Perhaps both of these things are true. Perhaps the grief and the ruthlessness existed in the same man at the same moment. That would make him very Roman indeed. The first stone of Rome was laid in a brother's blood. April 21, 753 BCE, the date Roman tradition would celebrate as the city's birthday for centuries. Romulus harnessed a white bull and a white cow to a bronze plow and drove the furrow of the pomerium around the Palatine Hill. Where the gates would be, he lifted the plow from the earth so that the sacred boundary would not be closed against entry. He gave the city a name. Roma, his name, his city, his alone. Remus's name is nowhere in it. But the city had a problem. It had no women. The group that had gathered around Romulus, the outlaws, the runaways, the dispossessed young men of the Latin hills, was overwhelmingly male. A city without women cannot produce the next generation. A city that cannot produce the next generation dies with its founders. Romulus's solution is one of the most morally uncomfortable episodes in Roman founding mythology, and it deserves to be confronted directly. He organized a festival and invited the neighboring Sabine people, a community that had what Rome lacked: families, women, children, the full human complement. The Sabines came in good faith, with their wives and daughters and sons, to celebrate the founding of this new city. Games were staged, feasts were laid, and at a prearranged signal from Romulus, the Roman men seized the Sabine women and carried them away. The episode is known in English as the Rape of the Sabine Women, though the Latin word used, raptio, means abduction rather than specifically sexual assault. The ancient Roman sources go to considerable lengths to insist that the women were treated with respect. That Romulus personally addressed each one and promised her an honorable place as a Roman wife, that there was no immediate physical violence. This was, from the Roman perspective, a pragmatic necessity, a terrible thing, but a necessary one. From an honest modern perspective, it was a mass abduction. We should say so plainly. What followed was war. The Sabine men, fathers, brothers, the men who had come to a festival and found their families stolen, organized and marched. For a time, the young city seemed likely to be crushed by the very people its founder had wronged. But then something unexpected happened. The Sabine women, by now mothers of Roman children, living lives that had, in the difficult alchemy of human adaptation, become their own, walked out between the armies. They stood in the space between two forces that were about to collide and spoke. The words the ancient sources give them are, across multiple versions, essentially the same: we are the ones between you. If you fight, we are the ones who will suffer. If our fathers win, we lose our husbands. If our husbands win, we lose our fathers. Either way, we lose. Do not do this. The armies stood down. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, agreed to rule Rome alongside Romulus. The two peoples merged, and Rome, from its very first generation, was something more than a Latin city. It was already an amalgam. A made thing, a community assembled from different origins. This capacity to absorb outsiders, to incorporate the conquered and the neighboring and the different would become, over the next 8 centuries, one of the defining characteristics of Roman civilization. The willingness to make Romans out of people who had not been born Roman. The empire is already implicit in that first merger. But the merger happened because women walked between armies and refused to let men they loved kill each other. Romulus ruled for 35 years. He built the Senate, the council of elder men whose authority would shape Roman politics for centuries. He established the basic social division between the patricians, the aristocratic families, and the plebeians. The common people, a tension that would generate conflict, reform, and eventually the transformation of the republic itself. He organized the army. He established temples and priesthoods. He was, in the most literal sense, the architect of Roman civilization. But he also made enemies. As the years passed, Romulus grew more autocratic, less willing to consult, more certain of his own authority. Increasingly reluctant to acknowledge any limit on his power. The senators who served in his council were men of proud families who had their own ideas about how power should be exercised. The tension between a singular, charismatic leader and a collective body that believes its own authority is legitimate. This tension is as old as political organization itself. Rome was living it from the very first generation. And then, one day during a military review, a storm came. Violent and sudden, as the ancient sources describe it: darkness at midday, thunder, lightning, a wind that swept across the field and drove the soldiers to cover their faces with their cloaks. When the storm passed, and they looked up, Romulus was gone. No body, no blood, no trace of any kind. The official explanation, promoted by a senator named Julius Proculus, who claimed a divine vision, was that Mars had descended in his chariot and carried his son up to the gods. Romulus had become the divine protector of Rome, the god Quirinus, whose name the Romans would invoke in their most solemn oaths for centuries. The unofficial explanation, whispered in the corners of Roman memory, was darker: that the senators had taken advantage of the storm's cover to murder a king who had become a tyrant. And that each man carried a piece of the body out of the field hidden beneath his toga. We cannot know which story is true. We may never know, but it is worth sitting with the fact that both stories existed simultaneously in Roman memory. And that the Romans told both of them, and that they seem to have found this duality, the god king and the murdered tyrant, not contradictory but somehow appropriate. That is very Roman. That is, perhaps, the first thoroughly Roman thing about this story. After Romulus came a man whose story is less dramatic and more important: Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. Numa was a Sabine outsider chosen to rule a city still raw from its violent founding. He was, by all ancient accounts, a man of profound religiosity, of philosophical temperament, of remarkable personal quietude. Everything that Romulus had not been. He ruled for 43 years, and during those years, if the tradition can be believed, and it almost certainly overstates the case, Rome fought not a single war. In an age when war was the primary instrument of both foreign policy and economic extraction, this was either a miracle or a legend. Most likely some carefully shaped combination of both. What Numa built was the interior architecture of Roman civilization, the scaffolding of ritual, law, and religious structure that would give the city its coherence across centuries. He organized the priestly colleges that managed Rome's relationship with the gods. He reformed the calendar, aligning the rhythms of religious observance with the agricultural year, giving the Romans a shared temporal framework that made them a community across the seasons. He established the position of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, a title that would survive, through remarkable historical continuity, all the way to the present day, when it is held by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. He built a temple to Janus, the two-faced god of doorways and transitions, of beginnings and endings, and established the practice of opening its gates during war and closing them during peace. During his reign, those gates stood shut. There was a story told about Numa and a nymph named Egeria. She lived in a sacred grove near a spring, and it was said that she met with Numa there in the evenings and revealed to him the divine will, the religious laws and practices that he then enacted for Rome. Numa himself apparently encouraged this story. It was, among other things, brilliant institutional design laws that come from a nymph's divine instruction carry a different weight than laws that come from one man's preference. If you want people to obey rules, you make the rules feel inevitable, sacred, larger than any human will. We might be tempted to call this manipulation, but every society does it. We simply use different vocabularies for the sacred. He also created the ancilia, the sacred shields of Rome. The story held that one shield had fallen from the sky, a gift from Jupiter, and that as long as it remained in Rome, the city would be unconquerable. Numa had 11 identical copies made, so that no enemy could ever identify and steal the original. All 12 hung in the temple, indistinguishable from one another. If the shield's divine power was in the original, and no one could say which was original, then the protection could never be removed. It is a remarkably clever piece of institutional design, wrapped in the language of mythology. Making a practical problem: how do you protect a vulnerable object from theft, into a theological fait accompli. Where Romulus had drawn blood across the earth, Numa stitched it closed with ceremony. Where the first king had written Rome's founding chapter in violence, the second king wrote his in prayer and in the careful choreography of people learning to live together. The father carved a path through the wilderness with a blade. The son paved it with intention. After Numa came other kings, warrior kings and builder kings, Etruscan kings who brought sophisticated urban planning to Rome. Who built the great drain that tamed the marshy lowland? The great racetrack, the beginnings of the infrastructure that would eventually make Rome the greatest city in the ancient world. And then the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose name tells you everything you need to know about why his reign ended. In 509 BCE, roughly 2.5 centuries after the legendary founding, the Romans expelled their king. They had endured arbitrary rule long enough. They had a term for what Tarquin represented: tyrannus, the Greek word for illegitimate one-man rule. And they had decided, with a permanence that shaped everything that followed, that no Roman would ever again hold that kind of power. They established the Republic, 2 consuls, elected annually, each with the power to veto the other. The structural principle was radical power must be shared. Power must rotate. Power, accumulated by one person for too long, becomes a disease. From one man's absolute authority, Romulus's, to a system deliberately engineered to prevent any single man from accumulating too much. The trajectory is almost poignant, when you consider that it would eventually reverse, that Caesar would cross his own sacred boundary. That Augustus would become, in all but name, a king. And that the Romans would let him, perhaps even welcome him, because 5 centuries of republican turbulence had its own exhaustions. But that is another story for another night. What this story gave the world is almost impossible to overstate. Rome's republic lasted 5 centuries. Its empire lasted longer still. The Roman Catholic Church, which carries the structural bones of the Roman imperial administration into the present day, has existed for 2,000 years. The legal systems of France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and through them much of Latin America, all of these descend from Roman law. The English language, which you are hearing right now, carries a Roman layer in every third word. The calendar on your phone is a Roman calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar and adjusted by Pope Gregory. But fundamentally the same structure Numa established 27 centuries ago. And beneath all of it a she-wolf on a riverbank. 2 infants. A shepherd who brought them home. A line drawn in the earth. And the choice made in grief, or in cold calculation, or in both at once not to step back from it. Here is the question I want to leave with you tonight. As the hour grows late and the mind begins its slow drift towards sleep. Every great civilization carries a founding wound, some act of violence or dispossession at its origin. That it can neither fully acknowledge nor entirely forget. Rome's founding myth does not hide its wound. It places the murder of Remus at the center of the story, names it, and builds from it anyway. There is a kind of terrible honesty in that. Does naming the wound make a civilization more honest, or simply more comfortable with what it has done? I don't think there is a clean answer. But I think the question matters. I think it matters now, as much as it has ever mattered. In our next episode, we move forward 3 centuries, to the moment when everything Rome had built seemed on the verge of being erased. A Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca will cross the Alps. With war elephants and an army of mercenaries, descend into Italy, and inflict on Rome the worst defeats in its history. Tens of thousands of Romans will die in a single afternoon at Cannae. And what Rome does in response to that catastrophe, how it refuses the option of surrender, how it finds, in the extremity of loss, something it did not know it had, is the answer to the question of what Romulus and Numa actually built. We'll find out together. Thank you for spending this hour in ancient Rome. If this story found you at the right moment, please consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might want to hear it. Leave a like if the story moved you. And I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? What question are you carrying to sleep tonight? Now close your eyes. Let the Tiber carry you. Sleep well.